Canada's Indian residential schools have long been a source of national shame. But now new research reveals at least 3,000 children died while in the care of the church and government. You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Ratansi. In 2008, Canada's Prime Minister Stephen Harper apologised for his country's forced education programme for First Nation Canadian children, which operated for 150 years until the 1990s.
Mr. Speaker, I stand before you today to offer an apology to former students of Indian residential schools. The treatment of children in Indian residential schools is a sad chapter in our history.
A Truth and Reconciliation Commission was set up to examine the systematic mistreatment of students at residential schools. And this week, a researcher affiliated to that commission revealed that of the roughly 150,000 children who attended the schools, at least 3,000 can now be documented to have died while in their custody. It's a finding that only adds to the already full record of abuse and neglect suffered by First Nations communities during the Canadian government's program of forced assimilation. In 2010, Al Jazeera's Steve Chow met some former students of the residential schools and examined the history of the program.
When I first come in here, I start feeling a bit jittery, like, you know.
It's been decades since Ray Mason walked these hallways. Still, the memories of abuse he suffered as a child in one of Canada's residential schools continues to haunt him.
So this is the bathroom? Yeah, this was the bathroom shower area.
He shows us one area where supervisors would take students for sexual encounters.
Like I said, I have a hard time even discussing it, you know, because you know, like just being in here is struggling, you know.
In 1840, the Canadian government began forcibly taking Aboriginal children from their families and placing them in institutions run by Christian churches. It was a program meant to educate, civilize, and in officials' words, remove the Indian from the children. Instead, it created a system that exposed many to physical and sexual abuse.
Taking me by, grabbing me by the hand, or, you know.
Mason remembers when he was first attacked in the school kitchen. He was only 9 years old.
And that's where I was, I guess, if you want to say sexually, you know, raped. You know, like I didn't know. You know, I never had any encounter, but I didn't know what sex was about.
Down the road from Mason's hometown in the city of Winnipeg, the government is now trying to make up for what it admits is a sad chapter in its history.
This is the main street of the city right there.
Justice Murray Sinclair leads Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And it's here in these offices residential school survivors, as they call themselves, will get their first chance to publicly share what they endured.
We need to identify what's gone wrong.
Sinclair believes documenting this dark period is a crucial step towards rebuilding a shattered society.
Where we would have been had this not happened to us. That's the question. Where would we be? What would be going on now if this colonial tragedy had not occurred? If this racist philosophy had not been allowed to come into this country? Where would we be?
While the commission doesn't have the power to lay charges, Sinclair says the evidence gathered could be used in court.
Where would they have been?
Including possibly where a number of Aboriginal children who went missing and were never accounted for are buried. After all these years, it's still unknown how many children were killed by those responsible for caring for them. Some estimate the number to be in the thousands. What is known is that many were dumped in unmarked graves around schools, churches, and cemeteries like this one. The government shut down the last residential school 15 years ago, but the impact on Aboriginal communities can still be seen on the streets of many of Canada's major cities. Mason fears his people may never regain their culture. He himself can hardly speak his native language.
That was their personal agenda, to take the Indian out of us. make us act white, live white, and speak white.
Mason is encouraging others to testify at the commission, but he's chosen not to, saying reliving the past too often is simply too much to bear. Steve Chow, Al Jazeera, Portage la Prairie, Canada.
We're joined from Montreal by Kimberly Murray. She's Executive Director of the Truth and Reconciliation Committee of Canada. And from Ottawa, Cindy Blackstock is Executive Director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada. Kimberly Murray, first of all then, perhaps you can contextualize this figure of 3,000 children. What exactly does it represent?
Well, first off, it's our preliminary data that we've collected so far from statements from survivors that we've spoken to over the last 3 years of our mandate. It also represents the numbers of deaths that we were able to determine by reviewing documentation that we've received from the parties to the settlement agreement. So currently we have approximately just over 1 million documents that have been produced to the Commission from the Government of Canada and from church representatives. So we've been working on reviewing those records and determining how many kids actually died while they were in attendance at the residential schools. So it's very early data that we have right now.
Right, so what sort of time frame are we looking at for this data then to be analysed and to get a really full understanding of what exactly occurred at these schools?
Well, currently our mandate of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission ends in July of 2014, at which time we will be producing a final report. And certainly part of the report will be our findings around the children that died in the residential schools, and also with respect to what we've learned about where those children are buried and the kids that we haven't been able to find through the records. I do want to say that we have up to almost, it's estimated that there's approximately 4 million more records that may be produced to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So we certainly have a lot of data that we have to go through, and we continue to speak to survivors at our events and hear from survivors with respect to what they know about kids that died while they were in school.
And I know you haven't been able to deeply analyze these numbers, but at least in your preliminary findings, what are the major causes of death?
Well, certainly we're seeing that a large percentage of the deaths that we have found in the documentation was from illness, from TB, obviously. But we also have deaths that were accidental. As you may know, the children, when they were in these schools, were forced to work on the farms and forced to work in the schools. So there are a number of deaths that are related to what we would call workplace type deaths. We also have a number of deaths of children that froze to death or died when they were running away from the schools and lost their way and never made it home. So we have various accidental deaths. We also know that from looking at our documentation, many fires occurred in the residential schools, and we have documents related to a number of fire-related deaths of whole wards of dormitories of kids dying because they were not able to get out of the school because the doors were locked or there was no fire escape.
Professor Blackstock, I mean, here's where some of the criticism comes in of the reporting that's been done on this, or at least the headlines. Some have argued, well, you know, disease was rife in those days. It was a fact of life. Fire was rife. We didn't have the same safety standards then as we do now. What exactly can we make of 3,000 children dying in an institution? That doesn't seem so out of the ordinary for the era.
Well, it was out of ordinary for one of the top experts in tuberculosis of the time, Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce, who was recruited by the Department of Indian Affairs to go out and survey the health of the First Nations children in those schools. And what he found is that the death rates in the schools that he looked at were 24% per year, and if you followed the children over a period of 3 years, it was 48%. He also made the point that although tuberculosis was happening among other Canadians, The government of Canada had put far more investments in the prevention and detection and treatment of tuberculosis for non-Aboriginal people than they did for First Nations, even though the incident rate was higher for tuberculosis amongst First Nations. So Bryce had called on the government to take the action needed to stop these children from having to be exposed to tuberculosis and tragically dying from it. In his view, when you read the report, it's clear that Bryce, of the time in 1907, felt that many of these deaths could be prevented had the government taken the action required.
Kimberly Murray, it's worth underlining, though, that we're talking about a period from the 1870s to the 1990s. Again, it's very preliminary, all this data, but at the very least, did we see a decline in the sort of death rates over time?
We are currently, with this preliminary data, we do see a decline in the death rate among the schools. We see it dropping off as we reach the 1960s. But if I could just mention, follow up on what Cindy Blackstock has said, one of the things that we're learning from the documents that we are going through is that it was very well known to the operators of the school, the government, and the churches that these were death traps. And there's a lot of documentation amongst the parties about what should be done to rectify the situation. And it all came down to dollars and cents and how it wasn't feasible to improve the conditions of the schools to protect these children's lives. So that will be something that will be discussed in the TRC's final report about who knew what when and what they were willing to do to fix the situation to save the lives of these children.
Is there any explanation, though, of why there was no official tally and record of many of the deaths, at least after 1917, and why it was thought necessary to bury them in unmarked graves?
Well, that's a very good question, and that's something that we're continuing to try and find answers to. And we're hoping that we'll find some documentation regarding that. We certainly know, we do have documentation relating to 50 cemeteries where children have been buried. Some have marked graves and some have unmarked graves that we're still trying to determine and find linkages to find out who those children are in those graves. Each child that died, there's documentation, well, I shouldn't say each child. There are documents that relate to a number of the deaths where they discuss what to do with the child and whether to return the child to their home community. And many, we've heard from survivors that families were not told of their children's death at the time. And so this is part of the bigger questions that the TRC is looking at through the documents and through testimony of our survivors that are currently alive today.
Professor Blackstone, help us understand the context of these schools. This official policy of assimilation up to the 90s then, with these schools remaining open. I mean, give us some more details about this.
Well, the schools did remain open until 1996 in this country, and that's really surprising to many people that they continued for that long. And as Kim is saying, the documented record that I've looked at have shown that during the time when they were operating, the government of Canada was aware of the hazards and harms of these schools to children. There were solutions available to remedy it, and yet they chose not to implement those solutions, often for financial issues. What's surprising to me is the real question about residential schools is the opportunity to learn from it. And that's the work of the TRC, is to educate us all on how we understand it to make sure we're not doing the same thing again. But I'm worried that the government is in many ways doing the same thing again, because on Monday, the 25th of February, the Canadian government will appear before the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal to account for allegations that it's racially discriminating against this generation of First Nations children by providing inadequate and flawed child and family services, which is resulting in another generation of First Nations children being removed from their families and from their cultures in disproportionate and preventable ways, in my view.
And perhaps we'll return to what truth and reconciliation really means in practical terms in a moment. But very quickly, I do need to ask one thing, Kimberly Murray. When Stephen Harper apologized, he did begin his apology by saying, while some former students have spoken positively about their experiences at residential schools, these stories are far overshadowed by tragic accounts of emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. Is there some wider context of harmony that we were in danger of missing?
Well, certainly there is truth to that. Certainly the Commission has heard from a number, we've heard close to 4,000 testimonies now, statements from survivors, and there are a number of survivors that speak positively of their experience in the schools. And mostly these are people that have come from second, third generations of families that have gone to residential school. And bear in mind that sometimes the school was better than the home condition that they grew up in because of the legacy of the schools in that community. But overwhelmingly, the number of testimonies that we've received, they have not been positive experiences, and they were fraught with abuse, physical, emotional, and sexual abuse.
All right, Professor Blackstock, then let's return to this philosophy, this attempt at social engineering that was assimilation. How would it be possible for the administrators of these schools to think that the brutality and neglect that is slowly being documented could be acceptable at such schools as part of a process of assimilation? Does this connect into wider schools of thought at the time as we discuss this whole concept?
Well, one of the things that I think is so frightening when you read the records is that the regular emotional and ethical values of individuals seems to get replaced as soon as they step across the threshold of the bureaucracy with the good and loyalty to the bureaucracy. So people would say that we are kind of doing what we can for government policy and we can only spend so much, and they forget about the fact that these are little kids. These are little kids who are suffering in these schools, they were dying in these schools, and it could have been stopped. And it's the same thing today. I think that we have evidence that the funding for First Nations children is unequal. There's solutions to deal with it. The government isn't dealing with it. It's a broader problem that needs to be talked about. It's not just a question of people of the period of years ago didn't know any better, because we're seeing those same patterns being replicated again here today. And that's what we really need to study and understand better, because we need to stop it from happening to this generation and all future generations of children to come.
Well, I'm pleased to say we're now joined by Frank Wallace. He represents the Indian Residential School Survivor Society. He attended a residential school himself. Frank Wallace, thanks for joining us. I suppose these reports are not surprising to you, but tell us a bit about your own experience. How did you come to be sent to a residential school?
Well, about 1959, I was a young boy, and we used to have an Indian agent in our community. One day I was walking behind my father and the Indian agent, and they sent me to a residential school that year, and with no choice of anybody else but the Indian agent and the government, I would gather.
And your parents weren't consulted?
No, they couldn't say yes or no. I had to go. So did all my other brothers and sisters. We were all scattered through BC, through St. Joseph's Mission and St. Mary's Mission, Seashelt, and St. Paul's. They divided up our family.
How were you treated once you got to the school?
Well, it was not a very good feeling there in the school itself. I suffered a lot of anxiety there, and hunger and cold, and being whipped, and many sorts of abuses that occurred there, watching my friends get beaten till they were falling down to the ground, and they had to get up and take some more, and it was a very difficult time for me as a little boy watching all this, and many other abuses, like I said.
We've been hearing that many of those who died, though, did so as a result of disease. I mean, how were people treated if they did become ill?
Well, that was the sad part. In 1959, when I was just a boy there in St. Mary's Mission, there was a boy in my dorm who was moaning and groaning and moaning and groaning, and the boys would run to his bed and look, and we could see he was ill, but nobody would look after him. The supervisors, the oblates, brothers and fathers just left him in his bed, and then in the morning they found him, he had died in his bed. And that was a sad day for this young man who never returned home. It was quite an emotional time for many, and they buried him outside in front of the residential school. I don't know if the families ever got notified that he had passed away there. And there was others who tried to run away from the residential school, and also some of them I never heard of again. I don't know whatever happened to them, if they made it home or not. And this was ongoing. I don't know whatever happened to them. I was too busy being in my emotional state and wanting to leave that place as well.
What does truth and reconciliation mean to you then?
Well, truth and reconciliation is, to me, well, we need to make peace with that part of our lives, and in order for us to get beyond that, we need to get more funding to help the communities all across Canada for ongoing counseling, because right now I'm aware of some of the establishments have closed their doors to helping other survivors who suffered the consequences of residential schools. And as a result, they're left standing outside, and where do they turn? They've come to me and say, what do we do now? Where do we go from here? How are we going to make this feel okay about ourselves, including myself? I suffered so many things of my own abuse that I've been dealing with over the years. I'm only one. There's many in my own community who suffered the consequences of residential school, and some of them have committed suicide, some of them incompleted suicide, and they've got no place to turn. They're too afraid to leave the communities because it's a taboo place of any school. The school was a very bad place, so many of them never got educated.
Professor Blackstone, I mean, the government now says, assimilation is a thing of the past. But it's interesting, in the recent Idle No More protests, one of the arguments has been that it is still alive and well, except being carried out through other means, whether it's environmental deregulation or funding patterns for reservations and so on. Do you think there is some agenda to continue assimilation through other means?
Well, I don't know if there's a deliberate agenda, but certainly the effect is that. And I think that's where we need to measure what Canada's intentions really are, is not in its announcements, but in the difference that it's making and its relationships on the ground with First Nations peoples. And as you heard just from the survivor, as they are rolling out the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and supporting that important work, they have cut a lot of the programs for residential school survivors and for their families. And they're continuing the inequalities for First Nations children today, which are contributing to growing numbers of these kids being separated from their homes.
Frank Wallace, do you feel then that the government is finally listening? Have the apologies meant anything in real terms?
Some of my community members, they say that's not enough. The care of the community members was so devastated of what happened to the communities and how the language and the culture was taken from them, and it has to be more. There has to be more to than just saying, I'm sorry. We need the ongoing care of our community members, and all across Canada. I've been working with many clients who still suffer and still cry and still don't want to leave the communities. They're stuck and remain on a community because it's not safe out there. That's the thing that I see and I hear from these community members.
Frank Wallace, thank you very much. And our thanks also to Kimberly Murray and Professor Cindy Blackstock. But that's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now.